A frozen Mongol warrior stands upright on his horse, eyes gouged out by ravens, and beside him, Polish people are selling soup. This isn't a joke. This is 1259, and Europe didn't just defeat the Mongols, they turned them into a nightmare that still trembles in history's darkest corners. This is the story of when terrified sheep became more dangerous than wolves, when farmers taught warriors what true terror means, and when the invincible Mongols tasted their own brutality for the first time. But to understand how Europe's most peaceful people became its most ruthless executioners, we need to go back to when the terror first arrived on European soil. This story begins 20 years earlier, in 1241, at the Battle of Legnica, where Mongols cut off European warriors' ears and filled 9 sacks. Think about that for a moment. 9 heavy bags, filled only with ears, thousands upon thousands of human ears, collected like a grotesque harvest. They made drinking cups from children's skulls, slaughtered 100,000 knights in 3 days. They showed Europe that no one in the world was more brutal than them. The Mongol invasion of 1241 wasn't just a military campaign, it was systematic terror. They didn't just conquer cities, they erased them. In Hungary alone, half the population simply vanished. Villages were burned so thoroughly that the ashes mixed with blood created a black mud that locals said you could still smell decades later. Polish and Hungarian people woke up at night drenched in sweat. In their dreams, the sound of hoofbeats and the faces of those merciless warriors. Mothers told their children stories about the Mongols to make them behave. Eat your vegetables, or the Mongols will come. It became the ultimate nightmare. The churches were full of people praying for God to protect them if the horsemen ever returned. But one thing changed. One man, Duke Bolswell, who was called the Chaste, meaning pure, he thought differently. While everyone else was praying, he was planning. While others had nightmares, he studied those nightmares. He thought, what if we learn to think like them? What if we become them? For the next 20 years, he did only one thing, understanding the Mongols. He interviewed survivors. He studied captured Mongol equipment. He read every report, every account, every scrap of information about how they fought. He wasn't preparing for a battle. He was preparing for an extermination. Duke Bolesław realized something crucial. The Mongol war machine had one critical vulnerability, converting their strength into their weakness. And that weakness was horses. You see, Mongols weren't just cavalry. They were their horses. Each warrior traveled with 5 to 10 mounts, rotating them constantly. They drank horse blood mixed with milk when food was scarce. They used horse hides for armor, horse bones for arrows, horse tendons for bowstrings. A Mongol warrior and his horses were a single organism. Separate them, and the warrior was just a man in fur clothing, very far from home, in a land that hated him. December 1259, when 30,000 Mongol warriors entered Poland under the command of General Nogai Khan, they expected an easy victory. After all, they had crushed Poland before. Why would this time be different? But as they advanced, they started seeing something strange. All villages empty, every field burned black, every well filled with rotting corpses. This wasn't the usual evacuation before an invasion. This wasn't scorched earth. This was organized annihilation. This was deliberate, calculated destruction, designed for one purpose only: to kill horses. The Polish had spent 3 months before the invasion poisoning the land. with arsenic and lime. They burned every blade of grass for 50 miles. They salted grazing lands so nothing would grow for years. They dug up their own graveyards and took the bones with them, denying the Mongols even the possibility of grinding skeletal remains for calcium supplements for their horses. But the most diabolical plan was gift horses. The Polish left beautiful horses in abandoned stables, strong, healthy-looking Polish mares, the kind of horses any Mongol would be thrilled to capture. But these horses were infected with glanders, a contagious disease that creates pus-filled abscesses in horses' lungs and nasal passages until they literally drown in their own fluids. And glanders spreads like wildfire through horse populations through simple contact. The Mongols, not understanding disease transmission, were thrilled to find these horses. They integrated them into their herds, and within days, the infection spread. Mongol horses started dying one by one, hundreds daily. First, they would develop a cough, then yellow discharge from the nose, then ulcers on the skin, then the death rattle as their lungs filled with pus. The Mongols tried everything. They separated sick horses, but it was too late. They tried Mongol remedies, but nothing worked. They watched helplessly as their most valuable assets died in agony. And then the real psychological warfare began. Polish peasants. Those people the Mongols considered insects. People whose families had been massacred 20 years ago became silent killers in the darkness of night. But these weren't soldiers. They were hunters. Men who knew every forest path, every hidden trail, every cave and hollow tree. Men who could move silently through winter snow and leave no tracks. They would enter Mongol camps in the hours before dawn, when sleep is deepest. No sound, no fighting. They simply cut horse throats and vanished back into the forest like ghosts. A Mongol warrior might wake to find his 5 horses dead, their blood turning the snow into red slush, and no enemy in sight. Without horses in enemy territory in winter, he was already dead. It just took a few days of walking through frozen forests for him to realize it. Once, 500 Mongol warriors slept in what they thought was a secure camp. Sentries posted, perimeter secured. They woke to find all 500 horses dead, arranged in a perfect circle around their camp, throats cut. Not even the sentry guards noticed anything. The Poles had done it so silently that not even the horses themselves had made a sound before dying. The message was clear. We can kill you whenever we want. We are invisible. We are everywhere. And you cannot stop us. The psychological impact was devastating. Mongol warriors who had conquered from China to Hungary, who had faced down the fiercest armies of Asia, found themselves afraid to sleep. They knew they were being hunted. They knew their hunters were patient, invisible, and merciless. Then came the poisoning campaign. The Poles began leaving abandoned supply caches, barrels of mead, sacks of grain, preserved meats. For the Mongols, who traveled light and depended on raiding for supplies, this was like finding treasure, but it was all poisoned, laced with hemlock and wolf's bane. Not enough to kill immediately, just enough to cause agonizing stomach cramps, vomiting, and bloody diarrhea that would leave men weak and demoralized. Some food was poisoned with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations. Mongol warriors would eat the bread, and hours later, they'd start seeing demons. Some would attack their own comrades, convinced they were monsters. Some would run screaming into the forest and never return. A Mongol captain named Bidar wrote in his dispatch to Nogai Khan, "The enemy is nowhere and everywhere. We conquer empty villages and rule over ghosts. My men shit blood and see demons in the shadows. The horses eat each other's manes from hunger. We find food, but it makes us sick. We find water, but it kills our horses. This land is cursed. We should leave before it devours us all." But Nogai Khan refused to retreat. To return to the Golden Horde without conquest would be humiliation. So they pushed forward, deeper into Poland, deeper into the trap. By January 1260, the situation was desperate. Mongol horses, those that survived the disease, were eating bark from trees, their own dung, and eventually each other. Warriors who had once drunk mare's milk and horse blood now watched their mounts collapse from starvation, too weak even to be slaughtered for meat. The Mongol force of 30,000 had already lost nearly half its effective strength without fighting a single major battle. Disease, starvation, psychological warfare, and mysterious night raids had reduced them to perhaps 15,000 combat-ready warriors, and their horses were in even worse condition. The Polish strategy was working perfectly. They had turned Poland into a desert that consumed armies. And now, Duke Bolesław was ready to spring the final trap. And then came the Battle of Sandomierz. This wasn't a battle. It was slaughter, hidden behind the mask of battle. It was an execution chamber, designed to look like a battlefield. Duke Bolesław had been retreating for weeks, always just out of reach, leaving poisoned supplies and dead land behind. The Mongols, now desperate for any victory to justify their catastrophic losses, pursued him toward Sandomierz on the Vistula River. They thought they had him cornered. They thought finally they could have the type of battle they understood. They were wrong. The Duke had spent 2 months preparing something special, a killing field designed specifically for Mongols. He studied every Mongol tactic used in 1241, the feigned retreat, the arrow barrages, the cavalry charges, and he designed counters for all of them. When the Mongols approached the city, they found the Polish army arranged in traditional formation, knights in front, infantry behind, banners flying. It looked like the kind of formal European battle the Mongols had crushed 100 times before, the kind of battle where heavily armored knights would stupidly charge and be cut down by arrows. Nogai Khan ordered traditional tactics. Light cavalry would perform a feigned retreat to draw the knights out, then wheel around and shower them with arrows, while heavy cavalry flanked from the sides. It was the same tactic that had won them an empire. But when the Mongol light cavalry began their feigned retreat, something unprecedented happened. The Polish knights didn't follow. They just stood there, shields up, waiting, disciplined, patient. The Mongols wheeled around for their arrow assault and discovered why. Their horses, already weakened by disease and starvation, couldn't gallop properly in the deep trenches hidden under a thin layer of snow and branches. Horses broke their legs by the dozens, throwing riders into concealed pits filled with sharpened stakes smeared with human feces, ensuring any wound would become infected and kill slowly through gangrene. The trap had been perfectly designed to counter every Mongol advantage. The trenches prevented cavalry charges. The stakes killed horses and riders. The feces ensured even survivors would die from infection. As the Mongol cavalry floundered in the trap field, horses screaming with broken legs, riders impaled on stakes, Polish crossbowmen emerged from concealed positions in the forest flanks and from behind false walls of snow. But they weren't aiming at the warriors. They shot the horses, every single horse, methodically, efficiently, like farmers culling diseased cattle. No wasted shots, no emotion, just systematic extermination of the animals. The Mongols, watching their mounts die, realized with horror that they were now infantry in enemy territory in winter, hundreds of miles from any support. And they were facing an enemy that had spent 20 years preparing for this exact moment. Then the peasants arrived, thousands of them, not armored knights, not professional soldiers, farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, butchers, men whose families had been murdered 20 years ago, men who had been dreaming of this moment every night for 2 decades. They were armed not with swords, but with farming implements, flails for threshing grain, scythes for cutting wheat, hooks for pulling hay, hammers for shoeing horses, pitchforks for moving manure. The tools of their trade turned into weapons of vengeance. Duke Bolswau had promised them something extraordinary: 1 silver penny for every Mongol ear, 2 pennies for a thumb, and a gold ducat for a Mongol commander's head. For poor peasants, this was a fortune. This was their harvest season. What followed for the next 3 hours was less combat than harvesting. The Mongol warriors, trained from childhood for mounted warfare, tried to form defensive circles on foot, but they were exhausted from weeks of poor food and disease. Many were still suffering from poisoning. They wore armor designed for horseback combat, not ground fighting, and they were facing an enemy that felt no fear, no hesitation, only pure hatred refined over 20 years. The peasants swarmed them like ants on dying beetles. They had developed specific techniques. They used harvest scythes to cut the tendons behind the knees, crippling warriors so they couldn't stand. They used grain flails, heavy wooden clubs on chains, to crush skulls through helmets. They used pruning hooks to drag warriors down into the mud where they could be dealt with using hammers and stones. They worked in teams, like they worked in fields. One would cut tendons, one would strip armor, one would finish the kill, one would collect the ears. It was efficient. It was practiced. It was harvest. A Polish chronicler named Jan Długosz, who witnessed the aftermath, described it. The Tartars died not like warriors, but like sheep in slaughter season. Our peasants worked in teams, turning killing into a craft, like threshing wheat. The screams lasted for hours, then faded to whimpers, then silence. The snow turned red for acres. The ear harvest, as it became known, lasted 3 hours. Some peasants, being practical, cut off both ears despite the single payment rule, figuring they could sell the extra ones to less successful hunters. Others collected Mongol fingers to make necklaces that they'd sell to merchants as protection charms against evil. Some collected teeth, which were ground into powder and sold as medicine. The Mongol commanders, identified by their silk undershirts and gold ornaments worn beneath their armor, were kept alive briefly, not out of mercy, but so peasants could negotiate who got to claim the head bounty. Sometimes brief bidding wars erupted. I cut his tendons, but I dragged him down. I cracked his skull. Eventually, the highest bidder would get the privilege. Then they were beheaded with the same axes used to slaughter pigs. The screams mixed with peasant work songs about harvest, songs about bread, songs about revenge, served cold after 20 years. It was the harvest they'd waited 2 decades for, and they sang while they reaped. Nogai Khan himself survived the initial slaughter, but only because Duke Bolesław wanted him to. The Duke had something special planned, something that would send a message not just to the Golden Horde, but to any future invaders. The Mongol general was stripped naked and painted with pig blood, a deliberate insult to his shamanist beliefs. He was forced to ride a donkey backward, facing the tail, a position of ultimate humiliation. And then he was paraded through 20 Polish villages. In each village, the locals were allowed to cut off one small piece of him, a finger joint, a piece of ear, a toe, but with strict instructions, not enough to kill him. The Duke wanted him to reach all 20 villages alive. By the time he reached the final village, Nogai Khan was missing numerous small parts and begging for death in Mongolian, Polish, any language anyone might understand. Instead, they took him to the village square, where Duke Bolesław himself was waiting, in front of a crowd of cheering peasants, including children. Nogai Khan was castrated with sheep shears, the crude instruments used to neuter rams. Then his wounds were cauterized with hot irons to keep him alive. He was dressed in rags, tied to a dying horse, and sent back east with a message carved into his chest in Mongolian script. This is what Europe does to invaders now. The few Mongol survivors who witnessed this and escaped would tell the story for the rest of their lives. They would say that the Europeans had become demons, that they had learned cruelty from the Mongols and perfected it. Meanwhile, at Kressenbrunn in Austria, King Ottokar II of Bohemia was conducting his own extermination campaign. The Battle of Kressenbrunn in July 1260 was different from Sandomierz. This was heavily armored knights against Mongol cavalry in open field combat. But the Bohemians, like the Poles, had learned from 20 years of defeat. They developed new tactics specifically for Mongols. Instead of the suicidal charges that had failed in 1241, they formed hollow squares bristling with pikes, like mobile fortresses. Swiss mercenaries with crossbows stood inside these squares, creating kill zones that horses couldn't enter without being impaled. The Mongol light cavalry tried their traditional hit-and-run tactics. They would charge, loose arrows, and retreat. But the arrows bounced off improved plate armor. European metallurgy had advanced significantly in 20 years. They had studied Mongol arrows and designed armor specifically to defeat them. When the Mongols tried direct cavalry charges, they impaled themselves on 18-foot pikes, held by men who had trained for this exact scenario for years. When they tried to wait out the Europeans, the Bohemian heavy cavalry, held in reserve, would attack. These weren't the old-style knights who'd been slaughtered at Legnica. These wore full-plate armor that Mongol arrows couldn't penetrate. They rode massive destriers, European war horses that could trample Mongol ponies, and they wielded war hammers specifically designed to crush through Mongol lamellar armor. The killing at Kressenbrunn was so thorough that King Ottokar II ordered his men to stop taking ears. There were too many to count. Instead, they just piled Mongol heads into pyramids along the main trade route from Vienna to Prague. Over 50 pyramid markers, each containing between 100 and 300 heads. They were left to rot as a warning. Some stood for years until the skulls were white. Travelers would pass them and know this is what happens to invaders. But the most horrifying fate awaited Mongol stragglers who fled into the Carpathian Mountains. Winter in the Carpathians is brutal even with supplies. Temperatures drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Snow falls for months. The wind cuts through any clothing. And the mountains are a maze of valleys and passes where you can get lost and die within sight of salvation. The Mongol survivors, perhaps 3,000 men who'd escaped the slaughters at Sandomierz and Kressenbrunn, found themselves trapped in mountain passes with no food, no horses, and no hope. Polish and Hungarian mountain villages had been warned they were coming. The villagers, hardy mountain folk who had survived Mongol raids before, knew exactly what to do. They blocked passes with fallen trees. They destroyed bridges. They poisoned the few water sources. And then they waited. Starvation in mountains follows a predictable pattern. First, you eat anything remotely edible. Leather belts, boots, saddles. You boil them for hours until they're soft enough to chew. Then you eat the frozen horse, carcasses you've been dragging, even though the meat is rotten. Then you eat bark, pine needles, anything that can fill your stomach. And finally, by week 4, when men start dying from cold and hunger, you face the ultimate choice. A Hungarian patrol found a Mongol camp where the occupants had clearly turned on each other. Bodies were butchered with the same precision Mongols used on sheep, major muscle groups removed from the thighs and shoulders, bones cracked open for marrow. Even the skin had been cooked into a sort of crackling. The survivors had established rules. The sick were eaten first, then the wounded. Then lots were drawn among the healthy. They found dice made from finger bones. They found a journal. One Mongol warrior's journal, recovered from his frozen corpse, contained a confession written in scratchy Mongolian script. We ate Timur yesterday. He was my brother in arms for 6 years. We fought together in Persia. We saved each other's lives in Hungary. His liver was diseased, black with spots, but we ate it anyway. Tomorrow they will share me. I can feel the fever. I am the next meal. The mountains are full of demons that look like peasants. They watch us from the cliffs. They laugh at us. God has abandoned us. The spirits have cursed us. We should never have come to this land. The mountain villages indeed watched and waited. When Mongol groups became weak enough from starvation and cold, peasants would attack with hunting bows and boar spears. But mostly, they just waited for winter to do their work. It was safer. Why risk injury fighting desperate men when cold and hunger would kill them for free? They'd find frozen Mongols in spring when the snow melted, perfectly preserved, their faces twisted in expressions of final agony. Some had tried to eat their own leather armor. Some had frozen while trying to start fires with numb fingers. Some had simply sat down in the snow and never stood up again. The bodies were stripped of anything valuable: weapons, armor, gold teeth, even belt buckles. Everything was taken. The bodies were left for wolves and bears. Some villages developed a gruesome economy around Mongol corpses. They'd harvest tendons for bowstrings, hair for brushes, bones for tool handles, and skulls for drinking cups. A bitter reversal of what Mongols had done to Europeans at Legnica 20 years before. Every household in some mountain villages had Mongol skull bowls used specifically for feast days. They would drink toasts to the heroes who defended Europe. They would drink to dead family members killed in 1241. And they would drink from the skulls of their killers. The few hundred Mongols who somehow made it through the mountains faced a final horror: the slave markets. The Venetians, always pragmatic about profit, had established a robust trade in Mongol prisoners. But these weren't proud warriors anymore. They were broken, starving, often mutilated survivors who'd eaten human flesh to survive. They were traumatized, half mad, suffering from frostbite and starvation. The Venetians bought them for almost nothing from Hungarian peasants. A Mongol prisoner might sell for the price of a chicken. Then they'd transport them south and sell them to Egyptian Mamluks, who found ironic satisfaction in enslaving the sons of men who'd enslaved half the world. The slave ships were floating hells. Mongols were packed into holds designed for cargo, chained together to prevent suicide. Many tried to kill themselves anyway. Some bit through their own wrists. Some starved themselves to death. Some went mad, screaming in Mongolian until they were beaten silent. They were fed just enough to keep them alive until sale: spoiled grain, rotten vegetables, water that tasted like bilge. Many died during transport. Their bodies were simply thrown overboard. Those who survived to reach the slave markets found themselves on auction blocks, being inspected like cattle. Buyers would check their teeth, their muscles, their scars. Some buyers wanted them specifically because they were Mongols, former conquerors reduced to property. It satisfied a desire for revenge that went beyond death. Children received different treatment. Mongol boys under 10 were castrated and sold as eunuchs to guard harems. The castration was crude, performed with knives and hot irons. The survival rate was perhaps 1 in 3. Those who survived were trained to forget they were ever Mongol, raised speaking Arabic or Turkish, converted to Islam, taught to serve in the palaces of the very civilizations their fathers had tried to destroy. Mongol girls were sold to brothels across the Mediterranean. They were marketed specifically as daughters of the conquerors, for clients who took sadistic pleasure in dominating the offspring of feared warriors. Their lives were short and brutal. Most didn't survive past their 20s. The Venetian merchant Marco Sanudo recorded in his ledger, "The Tartars make poor slaves. They refuse to work. They attack their overseers with their teeth like wild dogs. Many hang themselves with their own chains. But they sell well because buyers enjoy breaking them. The price has doubled since last year." Back in Poland, Duke Bolesław ordered a special monument built from Mongol bones. At the site of Sandomierz, Polish peasants constructed a church, but not an ordinary church. The foundation mortar was mixed with ground Mongol bones. The walls were decorated with Mongol skulls arranged in crosses. The altar was made from a single massive block of stone, the very stone where Nogai Khan had been castrated. Inside, they hung Mongol armor as decorations. They used Mongol swords as candlesticks. They melted down Mongol gold ornaments to gild the altar. Every element of the church was designed to humiliate and defile the memory of the invaders. They called it the Church of Divine Vengeance. It stood for 200 years, until 1460, when embarrassed church officials who thought it unchristian finally destroyed it. But local records suggest peasants secretly kept some of the skull decorations. Even today, some old families in the region have stories about grandfather's Mongol cup hidden in attics. The immediate military impact was decisive. The Mongol invasion force of 30,000 had been essentially exterminated. Perhaps 500 made it back to the Golden Horde. Many were missing ears, fingers, noses, or other parts. All told tales of poisoned earth, diseased horses, invisible enemies who fought without honor, and farmers who killed like demons. But Europe wasn't done teaching lessons. When news of the victories reached other European courts, it triggered what historians call the Mongol Hunt of 1261 1263. Suddenly, every minor lord wanted Mongol heads for their castle walls. It became fashionable, prestigious. A Mongol skull was a status symbol. Bounty hunters specialized in tracking down Mongol stragglers. Teams of professional hunters would scour Eastern Europe looking for survivors. They'd check caves, abandoned buildings, forest camps. Any Mongol found alive was captured for the bounty on his ears, or killed on the spot if resistant. The Teutonic Knights sent cleansing parties deep into Eastern Europe to find and exterminate any Mongol camps. These hunts were exercises in creative brutality, designed to terrorize any potential future invaders. The Teutonic Knights would capture Mongol scouts and torture them until they revealed their camp locations. Then they'd cover the scouts in pitch, set them on fire, and send them running back into their own camps as living torches. The psychological impact of watching your comrade burn alive while screaming was devastating. The Hungarian Baron Béla IV, who had barely survived the 1241 invasion, preferred impalement. He lined his borders with Mongol warriors on stakes, left to die slowly over days as crows ate them alive. He posted signs in multiple languages. This is the fate of all invaders. The Golden Horde made one last attempt at retaliation in 1262. A force of 10,000 riders was sent to raid Poland as punishment for the humiliation. They made it exactly 30 miles past the border before discovering that Polish peasants had developed an early warning system using church bells. Each church was within hearing distance of the next. When scouts spotted Mongols, they'd ring the alarm. The next church would hear and ring their bells. Within hours, every village for 50 miles knew Mongols were coming, and they'd evacuate, taking everything with them. The earth was scorched ahead of the raiders. Wells were poisoned, and Polish wolf packs of mounted peasants shadowed them constantly. These weren't soldiers. They were farmers who'd learned to fight like Mongols, adopting their hit-and-run tactics, but with crucial knowledge of the land. They knew every forest path, every shortcut, every hiding place. They'd strike at night, kill sentries, steal horses, poison supplies, then vanish into forests the Mongols didn't know. The Mongol commander Berk reported back in frustration, "We are not fighting an army, but the land itself. Every tree hides an archer. Every stream is poisoned. Every village is empty but watching. My men are afraid to sleep, afraid to eat, afraid to drink water. This is not war. It is being slowly digested by a hostile country." After 2 weeks of this psychological torture, with supplies running low and horses dying from poisoned water, the Mongols retreated. They had accomplished nothing, killed no one, conquered nothing. As they withdrew, Polish peasants followed at a distance, picking off stragglers like wolves, following wounded prey. Any Mongol who fell behind was killed and stripped. His ears were taken as proof for the bounty. The final insult came at the border. Polish children, some as young as 7 years old, stood on hills throwing rocks and rotten vegetables at the retreating Mongol army. And they sang mocking songs, songs that would be remembered for generations. The brave horsemen run from farmers, the mighty warriors flee from children, the terror of the East cries like babies, Go home and tell your Khan we're waiting. The Mongols, who had conquered the greatest empires on earth, who had made emperors kneel and kings beg, were being laughed at by children throwing rocks. The humiliation was complete. The Golden Horde never attempted another serious invasion of Central Europe. The spell was broken, the myth was dead, the transformation was complete. In 1241, Europe had trembled before Mongol horsemen, like sheep before wolves. By 1263, European peasants were wearing necklaces of Mongol finger bones and drinking from Mongol skulls, while their children played games called Hunt the Tartar with the captured helmets of dead warriors. The invincible had become the hunted, the conquerors had become commodities, and the terror of the steppes had learned to fear the sound of Christian church bells ringing the alarm. The myth of Mongol invincibility was dead, killed by farmers with pitchforks who'd learned that the secret to defeating monsters was to become something worse. Stories filtered back along the Silk Road, the great Mongol warriors defeated by European farmers, their generals castrated like sheep, their children sold in markets, their bones ground into mortar for churches. Other peoples who'd submitted to Mongol rule began to wonder if Polish peasants could destroy the invincible Mongol army with poisoned wells and farming tools. What were they so afraid of? Within a generation, the Mongol Empire began its long fragmentation. The Yuan dynasty in China would fall to the Ming. The Ilkhanate in Persia would collapse into civil war. The Golden Horde would shrink and divide into squabbling khanates. The great empire that had stretched from Korea to Hungary would break apart. The spell was broken when Polish peasants proved that invincible warriors were just men far from home who could be killed with pitchforks. Even today, archaeologists still find mass graves along the Carpathian Mountain passes. Mongol warriors who died from starvation and cold, their bones bearing teeth marks indicating cannibalism. Carbon dating confirms they died in the winter of 1260-1261. In Polish museums, you can see the preserved harvest tools, the modified scythes and flails specifically designed for killing dismounted Mongols, passed down through families as heirlooms for generations. Some families still have them, hanging on walls, with stories attached. Some rural Polish churches still have foundation stones that, when tested, contain unusual amounts of human calcium, the ground bones of Mongol warriors mixed into mortar. Chemical analysis has confirmed the presence of bone ash in mortar samples from churches built between 1260 and 1270 in the regions where battles occurred. The Mongols called their empire the eternal blue skies, but they discovered that even the eternal sky ends at the edge of a Polish peasant's scythe. They taught Europe how to be monsters, and Europe had learned the lesson too well. The last Mongol to leave Poland alive in 1263 was a young scout named Kutuz, who'd lost his ears, nose, and 3 fingers to Polish peasants. He made it back to the Golden Horde and lived another 40 years, warning every young warrior about the land of death, where the earth itself is poisoned, where invisible enemies kill without honor, and where farmers wear necklaces of Mongol bones. He ended every warning the same way, and his words were recorded by a chronicler. They said we were invincible. We were not. We were just men far from home who learned that when you teach sheep to be wolves, one day the sheep will devour you. We showed them how to kill without mercy. We showed them how to torture without guilt. We showed them how to hate with perfect clarity. And they learned. God help us. They learned too well. He was right. The Mongols had created their own executioners. They should have stayed in the steppes where they belonged, instead of teaching peaceful farmers the art of systematic slaughter, because the biggest mistake in history is teaching your enemies to be more brutal than yourself. The Mongols learned that lesson in the frozen fields of Poland, in the mountain passes of the Carpathians, in the slave markets of Venice. They learned it too late. And Europe? Europe learned a different lesson. They learned that even the most peaceful people, when pushed far enough, when given enough time to plan, when motivated by pure hatred refined over decades, can become more terrifying than any conqueror. That lesson would echo through history. It would influence how Europeans fought wars for centuries. The total war concept, the scorched earth tactics, the psychological warfare, all of it can be traced back to how Polish peasants defeated the Mongols. So the next time you think about invincible armies and unstoppable conquerors, remember this. Somewhere in rural Poland, there are old churches built on ground that once ran red with blood. There are families that still tell stories about how their ancestors killed Mongols with farming tools. There are skulls in hidden places that once belonged to the world's most feared warriors. And in those skulls, if you look closely, you can still see the fear frozen in empty eye sockets. The fear that came when the invincible realized they weren't invincible after all. The fear that came when the hunters became the hunted. The fear that came when they understood, too late, that they had created a monster more terrible than themselves. That's the real story of how Europe destroyed the Mongols, not with armies, not with knights, but with patience, planning, and a hatred so pure it burned for 20 years and then exploded in a harvest of vengeance that the world had never seen before.